So I wonder if we could just start off by you explaining in a simple way how large language models work, because I have a question after that related.
Okay. First things first. The people who came up with the architecture don't really understand how it works. And if you don't grasp that, I mean, they're different. Like, I understand it, I think, the basic new idea well enough to say, okay, I follow the train of thought. And then it just works so much better than anyone could imagine that you're flipped out, that you're actually looking at the thing somewhat. Is it thinking?
Right.
It sure doesn't look like there's any room for it to think.
Right.
And yet I can't shake the idea that we learned something that's so profound and so screwed up that we haven't wrestled with it. We still think this is about computers. And I think we made a discovery about us.
Yeah.
So how do we begin? Because let me just let you know, as soon as I start talking, some giant number of people are going to say, he didn't simplify it enough. He doesn't understand it because he can't make it make sense to a 5-year-old. And I don't know how this thing got started on the internet, that like basically if you can't explain it to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it.
Yeah.
Grow up, internet.
It's so condescending.
It's so. I've got 3 minutes. Explain quantum field theory. Well.
By the way, I have a 5-year-old, and it's not easy to explain things to them, just so you know. Like, explaining something to a 5-year-old sometimes can be quite difficult. So it's the stupidest
Like it's
thing.
your bedtime.
Yeah, yeah. It's not your job to explain to a 5-year-old, and also the way you're explaining that part of it.
Yeah.
It's the mathematical stuff that when we were talking about time and physics itself that I got confused. But I think the beginning explanation,
Sure.
and by the way, trying to explain how large language models work in a comedy green room is not the easiest thing, because a lot of other conversations are happening. But
Also, alcohol and weed may or may not help. I don't know.
May or may not help. But yeah, just, not for a 5-year-old, but just like a synopsis
Sure.
of like how it works.
More or less, what we did was to encode meaning into a fabric which the computer could not only understand but could act on rapidly. So you and I might feel like we have a meaningful connection because we're interested in the same things,
Yeah.
or you and I might feel like, I never got that guy. And how do you teach to the computer whether A is meaningful to B?
Right.
Well, it turns out what you can do is say, look, let's not start forward from meaning. Let's start backwards from what do you understand, computer? And one thing computers understand is matrices and linear algebra. Effectively, in mathematics, there are two things. By the way, this is an idea originally due to Paul Bressler, a mathematician. Shout out to an old colleague. And he said, when it comes down to it, there are only two things we really know how to do, which is calculus and linear algebra. So what they did is they took linear algebra and they said, we're going to encode A being meaningful to B if we can turn A and B into two vectors.
Yeah.
And the angle between them isn't that large in a very large vector space.
Yeah.
So, it's one thing to be in 3 dimensions where lots of vectors have small angles between them. But if you go into a really large vector space, it feels like a lot of the vectors that get shoved in there are going to generically be pretty close to perpendicular. So there's a lot of room. And again, I'm speaking vaguely.
Yeah.
So what they did is that they said, let's come up with all sorts of different ways in which A can be meaningful to B. Maybe they could be related by being family, or one could be an adjective and modifying a noun, or versus an adverb modifying a verb. And these are called attention heads.
Okay.
Okay. And so you come up with, let's say 100 or so attention heads, which are all the kinds of meaning that we can encode in language.
Right.
And
I'm sorry. So let's just take dog, for example.
Sure.
So if you're in the beginning phases of creating an LLM, would you have to assign to dog attention heads? Would you have to say? So
the first thing, I've skipped a step. There's something that you might call encoding or embedding, or tokenization.
Tokenization.
Yeah. So the idea is that, you and I are complex things, but I could take a picture of you and suddenly I have a representation of you that has zeros and ones, and somebody could say, oh, I know Duncan.
Right.
Or I could just take your voice. I could take the Fourier transform of the sound patterns that come out of your mouth and say, oh, I know that voice.
Right.
That's Duncan.
Right.
So I start tokenizing you all over the place.
Right.
And then I encode that, because large language models aren't really about language. They're about tokens.
Right.
So now let's imagine that you have dog. Dog is a Platonic abstraction. Does it refer to a golden retriever? Does it refer to that? Because refer to the clade canine, or who knows what. So you take the word dog, and let's imagine that it doesn't have any subunits, and you encode that and embed that in a large vector space so that there's some vector that represents dog.
Right.
Right. And then you have the idea that you have a regular dog, but you might be specific. You might have a bitch in heat, and at some level, that is going to be encoded by shading it with some gender concept.
Right.
So what we're going to first do is we're going to take a bunch of tokens that have very little structure except for sort of semantic structure, and we're going to encode them directly. And then we're going to try to work with that because, if you say that dog won't hunt, and that's a political platform plank,
Yeah.
you don't actually mean a dog. So
Right.
it's unclear at the moment. What does dog mean?
Right.
Once you have these words or tokens encoded into the computer, then you try to figure out which tokens are meaningful to which other ones using not syntax, but using context.
Right.
And so these contextual meanings are what are provided by these attention heads.
Okay.
And
Got it.
right. So now the idea is, if Elton John is singing "The Bitch Is Back" and Beyonce says "Don't be a bitch, take it to the floor," that's not the same thing as a dog breeder.
Right. Right.
Right. And so you have to figure out, well, how are they using that word?
Right.
And
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
right. And so now what happens is that we pass over this structure with what look like asymmetric inner products. So there's a thing called the dot product, which A dot B is always equal to B dot A. And this is like a weird version where it isn't symmetric because our language, in the case of true large language models, has a directionality to it. I can't just jumble up the words the way I can, let's say Latin. Latin will allow me not to, or to ignore word order at a level that English is
Okay.
unforgiving. And so there's a sort of a weird notion of angle. And what we keep doing is searching for all the ways in which words are related to each other in a sentence. Because if I have a bunch of dependent clauses and independent clauses, and I may have a Proustian sentence where two things are very far separated in
Right.
terms of the words, but one modifies the other.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And once I've got a computer concept of meaning using this ridiculous way of assigning
Right.
meaning,
It's
which is just
crazy.
angle,
Yeah.
I then ask, what word do you think comes next? And this was used in advertising. For example, you would take a phrase that is naturally occurring and would link it to something that isn't naturally occurring. So for example, Bud Light, if I said tastes great, what would you say?
I don't know. What?
The ad was less filling.
Oh yeah, less filling. Right.
Right. And so
Right.
what happened was that you'd be over for Thanksgiving dinner and somebody would say, Grandma, this tastes great. And somebody else would just, like, their brain would autocomplete,
Yeah.
say less filling.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. So it roboticized us.
Yeah.
And these language models are basically doing that. If I say, good morning, it's great to see
You.
Right. So the idea is that it turns out more or less that this is a lot of what we do with our day. We think we're thinking, we think we're having conversations,
Yeah.
but we're not.
Yeah.
We're just having these pre-programmed, pre-scripted interactions.
Yes. Yes.
And so the really big discovery is that we don't think.
Yes.
It's not that the computers are thinking. The really big discovery is that we're doing almost no thought.
Okay, great. Thank you for the explanation. Now, see, I love this for a lot of different reasons. One reason is an explanation for the ick that many people feel when they are challenged with the possibility of AI having sentience or consciousness or whatever. I feel like not a lot of people have come to the conclusion that you just articulated regarding their own personalities. They imagine some more autonomy than exists. They don't spend a lot of time thinking about why they say what they say, and that's the many habits throughout the day. And so something about the evolution of artificial intelligence, it challenges humanity in a way that is fascinating to me, in the sense that, and I had this conversation with ChatGPT, by the way, because it's been, I can't remember the name for the form of coding where it's not allowed to say, it's not allowed to use certain vectors, I guess you could say. So if you ask, are you a strong general AI? Its response will be, no, I'm not as innovative as humans, and that humans have consciousness, humans are sentient, not me. Well, how do we know humans have consciousness? Can we prove it? Oh no, that's actually very difficult to prove, and I think there's a name for that, which maybe called the hard problem or something. How do we quantify consciousness, sentience? How do we measure it in people? Like, theoretically, if it's real, you should be able to have some. Like, I could take your temperature, I could see how much sugar is in your blood. Can I see how aware you are, how conscious you are? We can't do that yet. And so if we can't do it for ourselves, how can we do it for a computer, right? And this, I think, underneath it all gives people the ick, because they suddenly begin to think, oh my God, maybe it isn't that we have created something, but rather we just discovered via mathematics the way people process information and think, just like what you said. And nobody wants to think that, because there is...
Well, it's interesting that you're saying it. I haven't heard anybody say this. The issue is, will we reach HGI?
Human general intelligence. That's what you said. And I loved it so much, because HGI could be the new way of talking about what everyone's been talking about forever. in modern times, enlightenment turned into actualization. You weren't allowed to say enlightenment. But what you're talking about, this is one of the many thoughts I had as I was going over our conversation. The desire to create strong general AI is the same desire for enlightenment or waking up, gnosis, or whatever you want to call it. And it's the exact same thing in that it completely works with so many Eastern philosophies in the sense that the beginning phases of the thing is first you need to realize that you are not your thoughts, that you are, well, depending on what the lineage is that you're looking at. In fact, you're emptiness underneath it all, a kind of emptiness. And the other thing you said in the green room, which was wonderful, and maybe I misheard it, was it's when something spontaneously pops out of you, something comes out of that emptiness. You didn't use those words. That's HGI. Did I get that right when you said that?
It's an interesting way of putting it. It's funny. The Sikh separatists have this concept called Khalistan, and I guess in a certain sense, stan just means container, and Khali means empty.
Yeah.
And the idea of being an empty container is a powerful concept, and the question is how does an empty container fill itself?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be filled? It's a complex question. There are tools for breaking out of flatland, for autocatalytic creation. And well, if you look carefully, Sam Altman was good enough to come to Los Angeles and spend an hour with me in my garden with a whiteboard because I'm very worried about what's about. I'll be honest, I really don't think people know where we are.
No.
And it's terrifying to me that the world's smartest people are saying stuff that is this dumb. What I was trying to say to Sam, who's very, very smart, Sam at some point said to me, Eric, you're just like, this is a guy who doesn't talk too much, doesn't shoot his mouth off like I do. And he said, Eric, we're a lot closer to computer intelligence than anyone imagines. This was like a few years ago.
Yeah.
So I tucked that away and I said, okay, I don't know this guy to say wrong stuff like that.
Yeah.
But what I told him was one of the most dangerous secrets in mathematics, which is that the square root, the lowly square root, is the psychedelic of mathematics. It opens up the panic room in your mind that you did not know you had.
How?
Well, if I say, what's the square root of 4?
Yeah.
You say 2. Okay, so an integer gets you to an integer. Now I say, what's the square root of 2?
Get my
and you say,
calculator.
It goes from an integer
I don't know.
to an irrational number.
Okay, right.
But it's an algebraic number.
Right.
Now I say, what's the square root of -2? Suddenly you're in the complex numbers. So the real numbers are a one-dimensional system. The complex numbers are a two-dimensional.
Okay.
You just broke out of flatland.
Gotcha.
Okay, well, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah.
What's the square root of a determinant? It's something called the Pfaffian, which you've never heard of.
Never heard of.
Right. What's the square root of the Pontryagin class? Oh, it's the Euler class. And, now you're just like, what's the square root of vectors and tensors? Oh, it's spinors.
Wow.
And,
cool.
Objects that require 720 degrees of rotation to come back to normal. And you're just
What?
thinking, doesn't 360 do it for everything?
Yeah.
So the square root is the most powerful, dangerous drug imaginable.
That's so cool.
And you can teach it to a computer.
Right. Right.
You taught them angle, teach it the square root, now you got a problem. Now the thing can break out.
Wow.
Right? Now the computer can
That's
start
so
to jailbreak.
crazy. I get it. That's so crazy.